Smoke still hung over the south field when Adeline Winthrop stood at the gate and watched a stranger kneel in her ruined soil. He let the dry earth fall through his fingers, slow, like a man counting coins. Then he smiled. Around her, the last of the cattle were being driven off for debt, and the Frenchman was smiling at dirt. 3 months earlier, her husband's uncle had gripped her hand at the funeral and said the only thing she would remember. Land doesn't care what you want from it, Adeline. It only gives back what you're willing to see in it. She had nodded the way grieving people nod, hearing nothing. Harlan had run cattle on this ground for 20 years, because cattle were what a man ran. She had never once asked the land what it wanted to be. She would not ask for months yet. The Winthrop estate sat on a long southern slope above the town of Cedar Hollow, in the dry country where the foothills broke into open range. From the porch, Adeline could see the whole of it. 400 acres of pale grass, a creek that ran thin by July, and the broad, cleared lawn her late husband had ordered planted to prove the family had money for things that served no purpose. The lawn was Harlan's pride. It was also, the bank reminded her, an ornament on a property that could no longer afford ornaments. Harlan Winthrop had died in the spring, thrown from a horse on ground he knew too well to fear. He left Adeline the house, the name, and $1,100 of cattle debt held by Silas Pruitt, who owned the mercantile, the feed store, and the patience of half the county. Pruitt had been kind at the funeral. He had stopped being kind in May. Adeline was 34 and had grown up in St. Louis, where her father sold dry goods and taught her that appearances were a kind of currency you could spend only once. She had married Harlan for his certainty. Now the certainty was gone, and the cattle were dying on grass that hadn't recovered from 3 hard summers, and she found she had no idea what land was supposed to do besides hold up the house. The hands had left unpaid. The garden had gone to weed. She kept the lawn green out of something like loyalty, hauling creek water to it in the evenings, while the working acres turned to dust. In June, she placed a notice for a caretaker, offering wages so low she was ashamed to read them aloud. 3 men came. 2 laughed when they saw the soil and the debt and the widow trying to manage both. The third was a quiet, sunburned man in a worn coat who had walked up from the rail stop, carried a single canvas bag, and spoke careful English with the round corners of France in it. His name was Etienne Moreau. He had worked vineyards in the Languedoc, then on a failed estate in California, and he asked for less than she offered. When she warned him the ground was ruined for grazing, he asked if he might walk it before he answered. She watched him go out alone into the heat and stay there until dusk, kneeling, tasting, looking at the sun's angle, as though the slope were telling him a long and interesting story. He came back at dark, with stone dust on his knees and certainty in his face. "Madame," he said, "this land is not ruined. It has only asked the wrong question." She thought him simple or flattering. She told him so, plainly the way her father had taught her to negotiate. "The cattle starve," Etienne agreed. "Yes, grass wants deep, wet ground. You have thin, dry ground on a south slope, full of stone, the sun on it all day." He spread his hands as if presenting her a gift. "This is poor pasture. It is very fine vineyard. There are no vineyards here." "There were no vineyards in many places," he said, "until there were." She nearly sent him off then. But Pruitt's note came due in October. She had no other plan, and the man asked for almost nothing. She hired him to caretake. He heard something else entirely. For the first week, Adeline told herself she had bought 4 months of cheap labor and nothing more. The man would tidy the place, she would sell what cattle survived, and in autumn she would lose the estate with her dignity intact, having tried. Etienne had other ideas, and he revealed them the way water finds cracks. Quietly, constantly, in every direction at once. He asked to see the deed maps. He walked the slope at dawn and again at noon and again at dusk, marking where shadow fell and where it didn't. He dug holes she hadn't asked for and crouched over them, crumbling clods between his fingers, murmuring in French to no one. He came to the porch each evening with reports she didn't understand and didn't want. "The upper slope," he said, 12 acres. The stone holds the day's heat and gives it back at night. The drainage is fast, bad for grass, perfect for the vine, which does not like wet feet. With cuttings, with 2 years, 3. "I don't have 3 years," she said. "I have until October." That stopped him only briefly. "Then we begin in a way the bank can see," he said. "We show them the land has worth beyond the cattle, worth they can lend against." She did not believe banks lent against a foreigner's dream. She believed in cattle, in lawns, in the things her husband had believed, because believing in them was the last way she had of keeping him in the house. The town, when it heard, helped her doubt. She went into Cedar Hollow for flour and came out carrying gossip. The widow Winthrop had hired a Frenchman to grow wine on a cattle ranch. Men she'd known for years touched their hats and smiled past her. Pruitt himself stopped her on the boardwalk, all warmth, and said he hoped she wasn't spending money she'd soon owe him on foolishness. The kindness in it was worse than cruelty. That night she nearly told Etienne to pack. The words were in her mouth. But he was out on the dark slope with a lantern, on his knees again. And when she walked out to dismiss him, she found him not working, but simply looking. At the stars over the stone, at the shape of the land against the sky. He didn't hear her. He was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere the ground was already green. She stood watching a man see a future in dirt that everyone else had given up on. She went back inside without a word. She could not yet say why. In the morning she found him at the edge of the great lawn. Harlan's lawn, the green proof of the family's worth, with a spade in his hand and a question on his face. "This ground," he said gently, "is the best on the property. South-facing, gentle, the deep soil. It is the heart of the vineyard, madame, if you are willing." The lawn was the last thing of Harlan's she had kept alive. To tear it up was to admit the old answer was wrong. She stood a long time. Then she thought of October, and of the man kneeling under the stars, and of an uncle's words she'd barely heard. "Tear it up," she said, before she could take it back. The help came from a direction she hadn't expected. Maylin Ostrander ran the town's small nursery and had buried a husband of her own 2 winters back. She delivered seedling stock to estates all over the county and had learned, she said, exactly how a town treats a woman who keeps land alone. She began stopping by with cuttings, with advice, with a flat, practical kindness that asked nothing back. "They laughed at my greenhouses, too," she told Adeline, watching Etienne lay out his rows. "Let them. Laughing men don't notice what you're building until it's built. That's the advantage of being underestimated." They tore up the lawn in the last week of June, and the town came to watch as if it were a hanging. Etienne worked from first light, and Adeline, having committed, found she could not stand on the porch and merely supervise. She took up a spade. The first morning her hands blistered through her gloves. The second they bled. By the end of the week they had begun, against her will, to harden. The Frenchman taught as he worked, never lecturing, only narrating, so that she absorbed the vineyard the way a child absorbs a language, by living inside it. He showed her how the slope wanted its rows, not straight across as a man's pride would draw them, but following the land's own contour, so that what little rain came would soak in rather than run off. He showed her the stones which every rancher had cursed for breaking plows, and explained that the vine loved exactly the thing the grass had hated. The stone drank the sun all day and breathed warmth back through the cold high country nights. What ruined pasture made fine wine? The land was never poor, he said, lifting a pale fist-sized rock and turning it like a jewel. It was only ranched against its nature. You ask wheat of a desert. You call the desert worthless. You ask of it what it wishes to give. He set the stone down precisely. It is generous. Maylin's cuttings arrived in flats, slips of vine no longer than a finger. Etienne grafted them onto hardy rootstock with a knife so quick Adeline could not follow it, sealing each joint with wax, lining them in trenches angled to the sun. He talked to them. She caught him at it, and he was not embarrassed. In France, we say the vine hears the footsteps of its master, he said. It is foolishness. I do it anyway. A plant that is visited every day is a plant that is noticed. A thing that is noticed does well. They planted the upper 12 acres first. The stony, heat-holding ground he'd marked that first dusk then began on the lawn itself, the deep, good soil that would become the heart of the whole enterprise. Adeline learned to space the rows, to set the young vines, to drive the stakes that would carry the wire. She learned the muscles she had never used. She learned to read the sky for the thin chance of weather and the slope for where the frost would pool in a cold snap and where it would slide harmlessly past. Cedar Hollow laughed the whole while. Boys rode out to gawk. Men leaned on the gate and offered helpful predictions of ruin. One afternoon, 3 ranchers sat their horses at the fence line for the better part of an hour, narrating to one another every reason the venture would fail, loud enough to carry. Adeline's face burned. Etienne worked on as though they were birdsong. "They are not wrong to laugh," he said when they'd gone. "What we do has no proof yet. A man believes what he can see, and there is nothing to see but a widow and a foreigner digging up a lawn." He smiled. "We will give them something to see. It only takes patience and time, and those two we have, because we have nothing else." The work changed her. She had come to it a St. Louis dry goods merchant's daughter who believed in appearances. And the slope did not care about appearances. The slope cared whether the trench was deep enough and the vine set true and the water reaching the root. There was an honesty to it she had never met in town, where everything was a performance of worth. Here worth was simply whether the thing grew. She began to wake before dawn without meaning to. She began to know the 12 acres the way she knew the rooms of her house. When the first of the planted vines pushed out pale new leaf, actual living green where the lawn had been, where Harlan's monument had stood. She stood over it for a long moment and felt something she had no name for, something between grief and the opposite of grief. Etienne came up beside her, wiping his hands. "It begins," he said simply. "It's so small. Everything that lasts begins small," he said. "The vine is not in a hurry, madame. It is the most patient thing I know. It puts down root for years before it gives fruit, and then it gives fruit for 100 years. It teaches patience to whoever grows it, whether they wish to learn or not." She looked at the green and thought of October, which no longer seemed quite so much like an ending. July brought heat that would have finished the cattle and seemed only to please the vines. The young plants took hold in the stony ground and did not wilt. Etienne ran a gravity line from the creek's high point, a thing he built from second-hand pipe and salvaged trough so that water moved to the rows by the fall of the land itself rather than by Adeline. Hauling buckets at dusk, it was the kind of cleverness that cost nothing but observation. He had simply watched where the water wanted to go and asked it politely to go there usefully. Word of the gravity line reached town and was reported somehow as further evidence of foreign foolishness. A man too lazy to carry water. Adeline had stopped letting the talk reach her. She had begun instead to enjoy a private knowledge the town did not have. They saw a torn-up lawn. She saw 12 acres of order rising out of ruin, rows marching the contour, wires singing taut in the wind, leaves broadening week by week. Mei Lin came twice a week now, and the two women fell into a friendship built on the particular understanding of those whom a town has sedated pity. They sat on the porch in the evenings while Etienne made his last rounds, and Mei Lin told her things worth knowing, which suppliers would deal fairly with a woman, which would not. How Pruitt had squeezed 2 other widows off their land in the dry years and bought it cheap at the courthouse steps. "He's patient, that man," Mei Lin said. "He doesn't take a thing. He waits for it to fall and arranges for the falling. Watch your paper, Adeline. Watch every date and every figure. A man like Pruitt wins with the calendar, not the fist." Adeline took the warning to heart and began keeping books the way her father had taught her, every expense entered, every figure squared. The discipline she'd learned over a ledger in St. Louis came back to her hands. She found, going over Harlan's old accounts by lamplight, that her husband had been a fine rancher and a careless bookkeeper, and that some of what Pruitt claimed in interest did not square with the original note. She marked the pages and said nothing yet. Mei Lin's lesson sat in her like a seed, a thing noticed does well. Etienne taught her the rest of the Vineyard's year, how to pinch the suckers, train the canes along the wire, thin the crowded leaves so the sun could reach the wood. The work pulled the two of them into a steady, wordless partnership. They learned each other's rhythms over the rows. He learned she would not be flattered and stopped trying. She learned he meant exactly what he said and stopped distrusting it. Once, reaching for the same stake, their hands met on the wood, and both drew back, and neither spoke of it, and the not speaking of it was somehow louder than speech. He told her, in pieces over those weeks, about the estate in California, how he had nursed it 3 years from dust toward its first true vintage, and how the owner had sold the moment it showed promise, sold it out from under the man who had made it bloom, and kept every dollar. He had come east with one canvas bag and the knowledge in his hands and nothing else, looking for ground cheap enough that no one would take it from him once it began to give. "So you understand," he said, not looking at her, working the wire. "I do not build this only for wages, madame. I have learned what it is to make a thing live and then watch another take it. I would rather make a thing live that stays alive, with someone who stays." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing and handed him the next stake, and that was its own answer. By the end of July, the upper slope was unrecognizable. Where there had been pale dying grass and a pointless ornamental lawn, there were now 12 acres of green order, the vines small, still but rooted, climbing, alive. A traveler on the high road slowed his wagon one afternoon and stared, and Adeline realized with a start that to a stranger's eye it no longer looked like folly. It looked like a vineyard, a young one, a fragile one, but unmistakably a vineyard, the only one in the county, green against the brown hills like a promise kept. She walked the rows alone that evening after Etienne had gone to his quarters in the old bunkhouse. She touched the leaves. She thought of Harlan and of her father's ledgers and of the uncle's words she finally fully heard. The land gives back what you are willing to see in it. She had spent her whole life seeing only appearances. The land had taught her to see worth instead. The reckoning came on a bright morning in early August, and it came in a buggy. The president of the Cattlemen's Bank in the county seat had heard, through Mei Lin's careful seeding of the right conversations, that there was something worth seeing on the Winthrop place. He drove out himself. He walked the rows with Etienne, asked sharp questions, got sharper answers, and stood a long while at the crest of the slope, looking at 12 green acres, where everyone had told him there was only debt. "I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Winthrop," he said. "I came to laugh." "I'm not laughing." He took out a card. "When you're ready to talk about financing against improved value, come and see me. Not Pruitt. Me." Silas Pruitt heard about the banker's visit within the day, because Pruitt heard about everything within the day. It was the foundation of his power. He did not raise his voice or his hand. He simply began quietly to close the distance. His first move was the supply line. Adeline went into Cedar Hollow for wire and posts and was told with great regret that the mercantile was out, and would be out, it seemed, for as long as she cared to ask. The feed store, which Pruitt also held paper on, discovered the same shortage. The message was plain. In a town a man controlled, a woman could be starved of nails. She drove the long road to the county seat and bought what she needed there at higher cost, and entered every dollar of it in her ledger, and said nothing. Pruitt's second move was the calendar, exactly as Mei Lin had warned. A letter came on mercantile stationery, courteous as a snake, reminding her that the note of $1,100 fell due October the 1st, that the full sum and interest would be expected in coin on that date, and that he trusted she had made arrangements, as he would hate to see the property go to the courthouse steps over a matter of timing. He mentioned, almost in passing, that the interest had compounded to a figure she had not expected, near $1,600 now, by his accounting. 1,600. The vineyard would not give a single dollar of fruit for 2 years at least. She had perhaps 300 in the bank, and a slope full of plants too young to sell. She sat at the kitchen table with the letter and felt the old certainty of ruin close back over her like cold water. Then she got out Harlan's accounts and her own, and Pruitt's letter, and she laid the three side by side under the lamp, and she did what her father had taught her to do when a man's figures frightened her. She checked his arithmetic. It took her 3 nights. She was a merchant's daughter, and she knew that a sum stated with great confidence is still only a sum, and a sum can be wrong, and a man who profits by a wrong sum has reason to state it confidently. She traced the original note Harlan had signed. She traced each payment her husband had made, recorded in his careless hand but recorded. She traced the rate of interest the note actually specified, and then the rate Pruitt had quietly been charging. They did not match. The note named one rate. Pruitt's accounting used another, higher, applied not simply but compounded in a way the original paper did not allow. Over 3 years, the difference had swelled the debt by hundreds of dollars. Hundreds Adeline did not, in fact, owe. More than that, by the note's true terms, certain of Harlan's payments had been credited late or not at all, building phantom interest on money already paid. She checked it twice more. She was not wrong. The merchant's daughter was not wrong about a column of figures. She took it to May Lynn, who took it to a lawyer in the county seat, a careful man with no love for Pruitt, who studied the papers for an afternoon and then looked up over his spectacles. "Mrs. Winthrop," he said, "if these are your husband's genuine records, and the bank will have the original note on file to confirm the rate, then, Mr. Pruitt has been overcharging this estate for 3 years. You don't owe $1,600. By my reckoning, after a true accounting of what was actually paid against the rate actually agreed, you owe something closer to 600, and he will not want a court to examine how the figure grew, because the same examination would touch every note he holds in this county." Adeline sat very still. "He's done it to others, almost certainly, which is exactly why he'll want this quiet." The lawyer set down the papers. "You came here afraid you'd lose your land. I think you've just found the lever to keep it, but you'll have to be willing to use it. Men like Pruitt count on women being too frightened or too polite to count." She was willing. That was the change the slope had made in her. The woman who'd hauled creek water in the dusk a few months back would have wept and folded. The woman who'd torn up Harlan's lawn and learned the honest arithmetic of growing things laid out her ledgers and did not. But Pruitt was not a man who folded either, and when his courteous letters drew only a courteous request for a true accounting, he sharpened. He came out to the estate himself in his good coat on a fine afternoon. He admired the vineyard with the particular admiration of a man pricing a thing he intends to own. He stood at the crest where the banker had stood and looked over the 12 green acres, and Adeline saw plainly that he wanted it now. The ruined cattle ground had been a debt to collect. The vineyard was a prize to seize. He had come to take the land precisely because Etienne had made it worth taking. "You've done a remarkable thing here, Mrs. Winthrop," he said. "Truly. It pains me all the more, then, to think of it going to the courthouse steps for want of a few $100s. October is very close." He turned to her, all warmth. "Let me make it easy. Deed me the place now, friendly, and I'll forgive the whole debt, and let you keep the house and an acre to live on. You needn't be turned out. You needn't be embarrassed in front of the town. A widow alone can't be expected to run a thing like this in any case." It was, she understood, a generous-sounding theft. The vineyard would be his, the years of Etienne's knowledge his, the future his, and she would be left in a house on its acre to watch another man harvest what she had planted. The very fate Etienne had fled across a continent to escape. "That's kind of you, Mr. Pruitt," she said, "but I find I'd rather settle the true debt." His warmth cooled a degree. "The true debt is $1,600, Mrs. Winthrop. and due in coin in 7 weeks. I'd hate for sentiment to cost you everything. It's $612, she said. By the rate written on the note my husband signed and the payments he actually made, which I have here, and which the bank's filed copy will confirm. You've been charging this estate a rate the note does not permit, compounded in a manner it does not allow, for 3 years. She kept her voice as level as he kept his. I've had it examined. I expect a corrected accounting. And I should tell you, in fairness, that the lawyer who examined it remarked how very interesting it would be to a court to learn how the figure was arrived at, and whether the same method appears in the other notes you hold. For a moment the warmth left Pruitt's face entirely, and she saw the thing underneath, cold and quick and calculating. He had counted on her being too frightened to count. She had counted. He recovered his smile, but it had gone thin. These are serious accusations from a grieving woman who spent her summer playing at French gardening. Records can be muddled. Memories fail. I'd think very carefully, Mrs. Winthrop, before you say such things where they can be heard. They've already been heard, she said, by a lawyer and by the president of the Cattlemen's Bank, who has seen the vineyard and offered to finance the corrected debt against its improved value. You'll have your money, Mr. Pruitt. $612 in coin before October. You'll simply have only what you're actually owed. He left without taking the cup of water she had not offered. From the porch, she and Etienne watched his buggy go down the long road in a thread of dust. He will not stop, Etienne said quietly. No, she agreed, but he can't add, and I can. She found her hands were not shaking. My father always said the loudest figure in the room is usually the wrong one. I never understood why that comforted him. I think I do now. But she had spoken too soon, and the slope, which had taught her honesty, was about to teach her one more hard lesson before the harvest. The frost came early, on the 9th of September, weeks before any frost had a right to. It slid down off the high country in the dead of a clear, cold night. And it pooled, as Etienne had taught her frost pools, in the low ground at the bottom of the slope where the youngest vine stood. Adeline woke to find him already out among the rows in the gray dawn, motionless, and she knew before she reached him. The lowest 2 acres had been touched. The tender new growth hung black and limp on the wire. The leaves curled like burnt paper. 3 months of his knowledge, and her blistered hands, killed in a single still night. Etienne stood among the ruined vines and said nothing at all. She thought, at first, that this was the end of it, that the frost had done Pruitt's work for him, that the banker would see the blackened acres and withdraw, that she had been a fool to think a St. Louis merchant's daughter could grow wine on a dead ranch and outwit the man who owned the county. She sat on the porch that evening in the cold and let the old despair come. It was familiar. It was almost a comfort, the way ruin is a comfort when you've expected it all along. She had let herself hope, and hope had been the dangerous thing. Etienne came and sat on the step below her, uninvited, which he had never done. For a long while neither spoke. The killed vines stood black at the bottom of the slope in the last light. In the Languedoc, he said finally, the frost comes. Always it comes. Some year. The old men do not weep. They say the vine is patient, and so the grower must be patient also. The low vines are hurt, yes. They are not dead. The root lives. The root is years deep already. In the spring it sends up new wood, and it is stronger for the cutting, because the root has grown and the top must catch up to it. He looked up at her. You see ruin. I see pruning. The frost is only done. Too early and too rough. What I would have done in winter with a knife. The upper 10 acres, she said slowly. The stony ground. The frost slids past them, didn't it? It pooled at the bottom. It always pools at the bottom, Etienne said. The stone slope is warm. The high vines are untouched. They are most of the planting, and they are the best of it. She stood. The despair fell off her like a coat she'd outgrown. She had spent a whole summer learning to see what the land actually was instead of what she feared it to be, and here she'd nearly let one cold night unteach her everything. Then we still have a vineyard, she said. We have most of a vineyard, madame. We have enough. What followed was not a battle, but an accounting, which was the only kind of battle Adeline had ever been equipped to win, and the only kind that could not be taken from her by a frost or a man. She drove to the county seat the next morning with her ledgers, Harlan's records, and the lawyer's letter, and she sat with the president of the Cattlemen's Bank for 2 hours. She did not hide the frost. She showed him exactly which acres were touched and which were not, and she had Etienne's written estimate of the loss, which was honest to the dollar, and his projection of the surviving planting, which was sober rather than hopeful. The merchant's daughter knew that a frightened figure inflates and a confident one tells the truth, and she told the truth. The banker had walked the slope in August and seen what was rising. He had spent 30 years lending against cattle and knew exactly what cattle had done to this ground and to half the ranchers in the county. He looked at 12 acres, 10 of them green and living and the only vineyard for 100 miles, and he saw, as Etienne had seen in the first dusk, not what the land had been but what it was becoming. He financed the corrected debt, $612 to clear Pruitt, against the improved value of the estate, at a rate written plainly on a paper Adeline read 3 times before she signed. He advanced beyond that, enough to carry the vineyard through to its first vintage 2 years out, because a man who has watched bad loans go bad for 30 years can tell a good one when it is standing in front of him with blistered hands and an honest ledger. She paid Silas Pruitt on the 26th of September, 5 days early, in coin the true sum of $612, in the presence of the lawyer and a clerk who entered it in the record. Pruitt took it because there was nothing else to take. The lever had held. He understood, as he signed the release, that the corrected accounting now sat in a lawyer's file in the county seat, and that any move he made against the Winthrop place would invite the court to ask how a debt of 600 had been dressed up as 16, a question that would unravel every other note he held. He had built his power on patience and a quiet calendar, and a widow with a column of figures had turned both against him. He released the debt and was, for the first time anyone in Cedar Hollow could remember, entirely silent. The town's laughter died more slowly, the way laughter does when it begins to suspect it has been laughing at the wrong person. But it died. The blackened low vines were cut back that autumn, exactly as Etienne had said, the strong root left to drive up new wood in the spring. The upper 10 acres came through the first hard frosts of true winter and stood dormant and woody and alive, and in the second spring they leafed out thicker than the first, and in the autumn of the second year they gave their first true crop. It was not a large vintage. Etienne would not have wanted a large one from young vines. He thinned the fruit hard to send the vine's strength into the wood and the root. But it was real. They picked it in the cool of the mornings. Adeline and Etienne and Mei Lin and a handful of hands who could now be paid, and the grapes came off the wire, dark and sound and sweet enough that Etienne ate one and stood very still and did not speak for a moment, which Adeline had learned was in him the loudest possible praise. The first wine the estate made was modest, a few barrels, nothing that would have impressed the Languedoc. But it was clean and bright, and it tasted, the banker said when he came to try it, like a thing with a future. The second vintage was better. By the fourth, buyers were driving out from the county seat and beyond, and the only vineyard for 100 miles had become the reason people had heard of Cedar Hollow at all. The estate that had been dying under cattle debt was solvent, not rich. Adeline had learned that the land did not deal in riches, only in worth honestly earned and patiently waited for. But solvent and secure, and entirely hers, the note to the Cattlemen's Bank paid down a little each season exactly as the figures said it would. And in the third spring, walking the rows at the green hour after the day's work, Etienne stopped at the crest of the slope where the banker had stood and Pruitt had stood, where she had first watched a stranger let her ruined soil fall through his fingers and smile. "I told you once," he said, not quite looking at her, working a leaf between his fingers as he always did when the words were hard, that I had learned what it is to make a thing live and then watch another take it, that I would rather make a thing that stays alive, with someone who stays. I remember, she said. I do not wish to leave when this place succeeds, as I left the last. He turned the leaf, and turned it, and finally looked at her. I find I do not wish to leave this place at all. Or, the careful English deserted him for a moment. Or you, Madame, Adeline. She had known, she realized, what for 2 years. She had handed him the next steak every time, and that had been her answer, and she had been waiting, with a patience the vine had taught her, for him to learn to say it plainly. You tore up my husband's lawn, she said, and gave me back the land. I don't think I want you to leave either, Etienne. She smiled, and it surprised them both how easily it came. Besides, I've grown rather attached to the help. He laughed. She had heard him laugh perhaps 4 times in 3 years. And below them the vineyard ran. Down the slope in long green rows, contour curved the way the land had asked for, alive where everything had been dying, and the evening light came across the stone the way he had promised it would, the very first night, when she had thought him a fool. Smoke from the autumn burning of the prunings hung over the south field, the way it had hung the day the cattle were driven off. But Adeline stood at the same gate now with a different view of the same ground. Where she had once watched a stranger kneel in ruined soil, she watched a vineyard in its evening color, 10 and then 12 and then 20 acres of it, contour rows running gold and green down the warm stone slope. Etienne came up the row toward her, unhurried, a vine grower's whole patient future in his walk. She did not see a cheap foreign gardener she had hired out of desperation. She saw the man who had taught her to ask the land what it wished to be, and to answer finally what she wished too.